Hello, my name is Hermya, and this is my research on Olympic postponement and the future of Japan's image. I'm a senior global studies major at the University of Oregon. And we'll go right into some background on my research. So the postponement of the Tokyo 2020 Olympics from summer 2020 to summer 2021 marks the first cancellation for any reason other than a world war and the first postponement of an Olympic Games ever. So as national symbols of power and culture, Olympic Games in general are important to establishing and maintaining something called a country image. So this paper will explore the effect that hosting the Olympics during a pandemic has had on Japan's image. So mainly, firstly, there are many differences of this Olympics compared to past Olympics. And the main ways they were different were the spectator ban due to COVID procedures, meaning no Japanese fans or fans from abroad were permitted to spectate in the Olympics. And then also really heightened internal controversy about whether the Olympics should be held in the first place in light of vaccine rollout leading up to the event and protesters who were against the games because it put people living in Japan and especially Tokyo in some unnecessary danger of contracting COVID-19 due to the increased crowds and traffic that would be there due to the event. So the Japanese national image was also branded as Japan's recovery games after Fukushima nuclear disaster, tsunami, and earthquake of 2011. These games were supposed to be seen as a symbol of hope, using sports to kind of overcome the tragedy of 2011 and promote hope for the people of Japan. However, the tension resulting from the postponement and controversy surrounding the Japanese vaccination rates and evidently does not fit Japan's desired image of order and peace and recovery that the games were supposed to be. So the framework I used to discuss this is soft power termed by Joseph Nye in the 1990s. It identifies a trend in international relations of traditional forms of soft power or additional traditional forms of power such as military force or known as hard power to soft power, which represents more democratic values, human rights, and opportunities. So as it relates to the Olympics, soft power goals of hosting are centered around objectives like increasing trade, tourism, and foreign direct investment opportunities for the host country. And then also I used the term country image, which is a subset and outcome of soft power in that it is a result of the public perception and cognitive representation a person holds about a given country, something negotiated by the public. So the Olympics are an opportunity to display country image developments on a world stage. So as cultural and sometimes historically defining events, they're treated by host countries as projecting this global image or message, as was seen in the Tokyo 1964 Olympics, which was meant to present Japan after World War II as recovered and transformed. So the methods I used to answer my research question, how has hosting the Olympics during a pandemic affected Japan's image, is this. I interviewed 10 participants over a 3-month period from August 2021 to September 2021, directly after the closing ceremony of the Tokyo 2020 Olympic Games. So I chose to focus on participants who were affiliated with the University of Oregon, mainly for its culture of athletics and strong Asian studies program and alumni. But you can see from the table that the participants all have diverse experience and backgrounds, such as there's business executives, junior journalists, scholars, and faculty. So lots of different people were interviewed for this research. And my data collection was done using an inductive approach, meaning I came up with the codes, then the categories, then the themes. So this is an example, the highlighted portion is an example of a code and category and theme. So the code would be the Olympics are useful for exhibiting modern Japanese technology. And then the category derived from that would be Japanese technology. And then I would group the categories together to come up with a total of 4 themes. So these 4 themes outline my findings about the 2020 Olympics. So first is showcasing Japan was a theme. This means qualities about Japan that stood out to participants, such as technological advancement, volunteer force, and just any ways participants felt Japan and its culture were represented during the Olympics. Then the next theme was criticism, which means issues and concerns participants voiced about the 2020 Olympics. And that can be Olympic committee frustrations, financial pitfalls, and then also the media experience of the games that participants felt they were getting from the TV coverage. So then pandemic, which means thoughts on how the pandemic altered the experience of the Olympics. So the COVID response, citizen and athlete safety, how the future of hosting these mega events with massive crowds or spectators are going to have to be reevaluated. And then lastly, the most important theme of this research is humanity, which refers to moments that athlete humanity shone through. So this theme really reflects ways in which the humans were at the center of the Olympics, mainly the athletes, made their mark on the games and stood up for things such as human rights and mental health. And then the discussion of these themes, I wanted to briefly mention how the intended message of Tokyo 2020 versus the reality of the event played out. So originally presented as the recovery games, this narrative changed with the actuality of the pandemic. Like how participant 8 puts it in this quote, people became so focused on the pandemic, they forgot the real reason Japan wanted to host, the earthquakes. So in absence of this solid recovery tagline and media criticism, Japan needs to choose a new narrative to project its global image. And one thing related to this is the culture shift in the Olympics that happened this year. Instead, humanizing the athletes was the theme of this Olympics, indicating some larger cultural revelations and way of prioritizing mental health in competitions like the Olympics that are usually so preoccupied with competition and performance above all else. So some takeaways from this is firstly, dealing with the pandemic during the Olympics. So globally, these games have created space for discussions about the future as the pandemic persists into yet another Olympic cycle with Beijing and Paris. So if Tokyo 2020 can develop a respectful narrative in relation to COVID and the deaths that may have resulted from it, it can stay relevant for years to come and positively contribute to image perceptions of Japan. And then mental health athlete activism was a large part of the humanity theme. And this means that mental health struggles grew worldwide as the stressor of COVID reached all corners of the globe. And the topic of mental health in the 2020 Olympics was prevalent for the athletes as it was prevalent for some of the viewers at home who may have been going through similar things having to do with mental health. So one example of this is after dropping out of the vault in uneven bars due to mental health related concerns, the American gymnast Simone Biles spoke out about how the media reports and what viewers see on the screen don't necessarily tell the whole story of an athlete or their struggle. And then in the months prior to her Olympic tennis debut, Japan's own Naomi Osaka withdrew from the French Open, skipped on the Wimbledon tournament to preserve her own mental health. So though under heavy criticism, she also declined interviews for the same reason. So this cultural shift of the Olympics places a spotlight on Japan to respond to its own athletes and athletes who performed in the Olympics that were hosted in their country, kind of as to set the intention of supporting mental health in sports as a pillar of its country image within Japan, and sports diplomacy actions as a country could be really powerful for Japan to kind of harness and speak out about. So from a soft power perspective, taking on some of the mental health discourses that emerged during the games could be very advantageous for Japan to take control of that 2020 narrative. Looking back at our soft power objectives like increasing trade, tourism, and FDI opportunities, in the context of participant responses, it shows that although audiences do not necessarily hold Japan in contempt for hosting the games, the events expose certain ways Japan failed to meet their expectations for hosting during the pandemic, as represented in the criticism theme. So taking into account these opinions and views, Japan should address this in future sports diplomacy endeavors and other interactions with the international community. In conclusion, according to these findings, Japan stands at a crossroads to pursue new directions as COVID-19 and the Olympics caused the world to reevaluate how we lived during the pandemic. Japan finds itself with the opportunity to redesign its image to meet its tourism goals, boost its internal soft power by prioritizing themes such as mental health that arose during the Olympics. How Japan positions itself post-Olympics will be very indicative of how the country as a host will be remembered for years to come. further research on the role of athlete activism in country image, international relations, and scholarship on mental health and sports culture in Japan can use Tokyo 2020 as a case study for mental health advocacy in the context of the pandemic, and is something I think Japan as a country and should really look into going forward. So thank you for listening.